We've been talking about different types of AR that are being used in society. So let's also use this as a good excuse to talk a bit more about key aspects of augmented reality. What are the fundamental key aspects that allow for a convincing augmented reality experience? Unfortunately, this has been very nicely summarized by a paper by Craig from a couple of years ago. And they distinguish 4 different fundamental key aspects to a convincing augmented reality experience. And the first one is that the physical world, as we know it, is really augmented by digital information. So we have the real world, but we add some digital information to this. And what's important is that this is superimposed on your view of the physical world. So it takes into account the real world around you and superimposes some digital information to it. What's then important about this is that this information, this new digital elements that you start adding to the world, is displayed in registration with the physical world. So it takes into account properties of the real world. For instance, we'll in a brief moment look at an example of a vase, a digital vase that's placed in the real world, and it should then be placed, in this case, exactly on top of a real table. So it shouldn't just be randomly floating around as if it has nothing to do with the real world. It should really take into account the real world. This information, those digital elements that you add to the real world, should also be dependent on the location of the real world and also the physical perspective of the person that looks at them. So if you have one digital element added to the world, it will look different to you, typically, if you look at it from the left side, for instance, compared to when you look at it from the right side. So it should also take into account from what side you look at the digital element that is being added. And finally, for a very convincing AR experience, it should also be interactive. So it should sort of respond to your behavior. If you do something, it should reply to this in a natural way. Let's make this a bit more concrete by looking at an example. So here you see clearly 2 very real humans, right? And you see a very real table. It even says this is a real table. So let's believe for now that this is really a real table, 2 actual people. But added to this real world is a digital vase. So this is the digital element in this case. So let's assume that those very real people here are wearing those AR contact lenses. So they still see the real world, but a digital element is added to this. In this case, a vase with some nice flowers. Wow, how is this now really a convincing AR experience? Well, one important aspect is indeed that this kind of digital information is added to the real world, right? But not just added randomly to the real world. It really takes into account properties of the real world. So like a real vase, this digital vase is really standing on top of this table. It's not flying a little bit above it, but it's really on top of this table as if it's a real vase. So it takes into account properties of the real world. It registers those and takes those into account by just making it possible for this vase to be exactly on top of this table. And this also makes it realistic, right? If it would be just a little bit above it, immediately you would be reminded of the fact that this is a digital element, not a real element. So it takes into account, if it wants to be convincing, properties of the real world. It's also dependent on the location of those different people, right? So the person on the left will have a different view on this digital vase than the person on the right. So this vase should also look different to those 2 different people that have a different viewpoint. If you get closer to this digital vase, it should become bigger relatively in your field of view, because also if you approach a real object, it becomes bigger and bigger the closer you get to it. Relatively, right? Not in absolute terms. And finally, for a very convincing AR experience, it should also be interactive. So it should respond to what you're doing. Ideally, for instance, you would want to get some kind of feedback, sort of if you get really close and even try to touch it. But of course, in many cases, this is still, technology doesn't completely allow this yet. But if you want the experience to be more convincing, ideally it's interactive. So it should respond to what you're doing, to your actions, and it should allow for different actions onto this digital element that correspond to how a normal object in the real world would actually also respond to.